Hannah, congratulations on a year of BASED. It's so cool seeing this come from the basement with a laptop to the setup it's at now. From the foundation of listeners growing so much, and just seeing the work of your hand and the capabilities of your writing and your research and your passion for this. We are really proud of you. I'm so proud of you. There's been a lot of people that have helped, and I think all of them too would say that this is all, even with the help of others, all been possible because of your talent and your passion for this, and your heart's really evident in this and the work you do. So, love you. We're so proud of you. Get based.
Congratulations, Hannah. BASED is 1 year. We are so excited for you and so proud of you, and can't wait to see what the future holds.
Congratulations, Hannah, on your milestone. We're proud of you, your hard work, your efforts, and we'll be cheering on from here. As always, we love you.
Love you.
Hannah, I cannot believe that it is already the 1 year anniversary of BASED. Congratulations. I just wanted to say that I'm so proud of you and this platform that you have built, and I cannot wait to see what you have in store for BASED year 2. I love you so much. Congratulations.
Hannah, I remember when BASED was just a dream of yours, and here you are now celebrating your 1 year anniversary. Congratulations. We always knew you'd do big things, and you certainly are having a big impact with your voice. Keep it up, chick. We love you.
Hey Hannah, congratulations on 1 year of BASED. So very proud of you and thankful for you. And you've done a great job. We just hope that it continues to get stronger month by month. And we just appreciate your perseverance. And we're just love you and thankful for you.
We love you.
I'm so proud of you.
Hello, and welcome to our BASED-AVERSARY. Holy cow, can you believe it's been 1 year already? I can't. Time seriously flies when you're spending endless amounts of time investigating government corruption.
You guys, we have had over 200,000 views and downloads over the past 12 months, and that just blows my mind. Like I told you during my first episode, this concept was one I had in mind from 2016 on. But until COVID hit, I had been a road warrior. I was traveling the country, organizing grassroots, passing bills, which I loved. But the lockdowns had this one big silver lining for me, which was that I finally had the time to try my hands at this show. And I still remember my first episode like it was yesterday. I was so nervous, like shaking. And I was laughing at myself because I was literally just going down to my parents' basement to record by myself with a computer. I didn't even know why I was so nervous. But I think deep down, I just knew the show was important and I wanted to really make sure that I got it right. I wrote my first outline for my first episode by hand, and it was actually the first YouTube video that I ever made. I honestly never dreamed it would be so well received or grow so quickly. So thank you for your support, your encouragement, for sharing the show, for tuning in, and for all of the people who have quietly volunteered their time and their money to ensure its success. Because of you, I have been able to invest in some amazing new equipment. I have a teleprompter. So you're going to see some of that in action today. We've launched merchandise, we've expanded platforms, and we're constantly increasing our audience. This show is just an incredible example of what can happen when passionate, talented individuals choose to come together to advance a common goal. And I'm just so honored that I get to be a part of this community that we've been building here. When I began, I named the show BASED for 3 reasons. I get asked all the time why I named the show BASED. 1, because I believe it is essential for people to understand the base cause of the problems we face so that they quit prescribing the wrong political solutions. 2, because I think it is important for people to develop a set of baseline principles by which they evaluate public policies. And this ensures that you are not easily manipulated or swayed by political parties or emotions or proposals that merely sound good on their face. And 3, I named it BASED because I am committed to being well-researched and upfront with the facts on this show, aka BASED, as the kids call it. And after 1 year, I'd like to add a 4th reason, which is in honor of you, the base of this show. You all give me so much hope for our future, and I am just so happy that this show crossed our paths. So in honor of you, I would like to propose a toast. I love champagne. I'm very bad at pouring it, though, so don't judge me. I know you're supposed to tilt it so it doesn't get so fizzy. Just roll with it, okay? There we go. That's good enough, I think. So, cheers to you. Let's keep waking up the nation. I cannot wait to see where the next year goes. Now, on to the episode. We have covered so much ground over the past year. Socialism, capitalism, gun control, healthcare, immigration, unions, the list goes on. And there's still so much more I want to do an episode on, but for the 1 year marker, one subject stood out like a sore thumb, and I thought it deserved to fill one of the first 12 spots because it impacts virtually everything else in our society. So today, we're talking about, drumroll please, foreign policy. First, a story. I used to hold very opposite foreign policy views than what I do now. In fact, I was what I like to call a happy little neocon. Like, not only was I a warmonger, I was pretty amped about it. In fact, war was one of the things that I think animated me the most. I thought our wars were moral, spread capitalism, and ensured our safety. In high school, I once got into an argument with a classmate over my George W. Bush sticker on my notebook, specifically over my defense of the wars. In college, when my university hosted a debate between Obama and McCain, I signed up to host a John McCain party in my dorm room. I also wore a John McCain mask that Halloween and somehow got a hold of a John McCain beer glass. So if you're watching this via video, you're going to get to see a rather embarrassing picture of that time in my life. I would say I was like a borderline nationalist back in my youth. And I remember thinking that country should come before virtually everything else. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think this is actually a very common sentiment and mentality amongst the young. It's easy to fearmonger people. It's easy to rile them up with this sentiment. I want to be as clear as possible, though, as I begin to enter the subject, that I do still absolutely adore America. As you'll hear, my views on foreign policy, war, and our country's motivations have drastically changed. Over the years, I have experienced crushing blow after crushing blow as I found out more about our history, our present, and likely our future. And as I've learned more about economics, I've obviously moved away from nationalism. I would say the way I feel about my country now is much more nuanced. I believe we can recognize the atrocities in our past, the injustices currently being carried out in our name, which there are many, and the endless amounts of corruption present in our government, while still loving the ideals upon which our country was founded. And to me, loving your country actually means continuing to strive for those ideals while strenuously and vigorously rising up to stomp out the actions and activities that take us away from them. In fact, I would suggest that people who are the most critical of our government actually love our country and our Constitution the most, because we refuse to sit by and let the government make a mockery of our beliefs. There's a famous person that said that, or something like it. I'm paraphrasing, so if you remember who it is, drop it in the comments. Sorry, I'm not name dropping here, but I know somebody else gave me that thought. Anyways, on that note, before we dive in, I want to point out the vast amount of current and former military members who hold the exact views I'm about to espouse. I've been privileged to meet so many of them who've joined the Liberty Movement after experiencing the mass corruption within our military-industrial complex. And I'd like to take this moment to especially thank those members of our veterans community. They served honorably and with the best of intent, and when they found out that they were being used for injustices by our government, they continued to serve by working to expose all of the things that they've seen. You guys are heroes. I want to thank you. Leave a comment so we can all thank you. Okay. Per usual, we're going to go back to the very beginning, because that's how I believe we get the best understanding of how our country was supposed to function and what powers the government was supposed to have. And I also think it paints the best picture of what a country with a limited government and a free market would actually look like, because the beginning was unfortunately the closest we ever got to those ideals. We've been moving away from them pretty rapidly ever since. So let's time travel back. Unlike many subjects that I've covered on BASED, the federal government was always given a great deal of authority over foreign policy. As a refresher, under the Constitution, most powers are delegated to the states. We were supposed to be a country comprised of multiple mini-nations that band together for a national defense and a small number of other functions that the founders thought needed to be orchestrated by a central entity, like the currency, like a national defense. Article 1 of the Constitution enumerates several of Congress's foreign affairs powers, including those to regulate commerce with foreign nations, the exclusive power to declare war. That's important. The exclusive power to declare war. Only they have that power. Okay, remember that. They have the power to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, and to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. The Constitution also makes two of the president's foreign affairs powers, which are making treaties and appointing diplomats, dependent on Senate approval. Congress also has general related powers like the power to lay and collect taxes, to draw money from the Treasury, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. These powers basically collectively allow the legislators to influence nearly all manner of foreign policy issues. Congress also plays an oversight role on foreign policy. The annual appropriations, which is budget, that process allows congressional committees to review in detail the budgets and programs of the vast military and diplomatic bureaucracies, and they can determine how that money is allocated. Worth knowing, our defense spending accounts for more than 10% of all federal spending and nearly half of discretionary spending. So if you're somebody talking about big government and endless spending, you need to look at the defense budget because it's Exhibit A, in my opinion. Lastly, Congress has broad authority to conduct investigations into particular foreign policy or national security concerns, and the power to create, eliminate, or restructure executive branch agencies, which it has often done after major conflicts or crises, like when they created the Department of Homeland Security, which we talked about back on our privacy episode. Now, what you might not know, given how things are currently going in our system, is that the president is given substantially fewer powers over foreign policy by the Constitution. The bulk of these decisions were supposed to be made by Congress because it is much harder to get 535 people who answer to citizens to agree to war than it is to get one person, obviously. As mentioned, the president is given the powers to make treaties and appoint ambassadors with the advice and consent of the Senate. Treaties require approval of 2/3 of senators present, and appointments require consent of a simple majority. The president is also the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. Now, what does that mean? Because a lot of people get this misconstrued. It means they are authorized to direct the movements of the naval and military forces and to employ them in the manner they deem most effectual to harass, conquer, or subdue the enemy. This does not mean that they can just go declare war. It merely means that they have the final say on what the battle plans and strategy looks like when Congress has declared war, which they, of course, predominantly delegate to generals even when that does happen. Those are the only powers explicitly given to the president under the Constitution. But, as we know, the Constitution has never stopped anyone with a lust for power and two thumbs to rub together. So, what we commonly refer to as implied powers are things that the presidential office has expanded over the years. And that means over time, presidents have read into the explicit powers given to them and said, I think this also means I can do this. And no one stopped them despite the whole checks and balances thing. So now implied powers are basically just the rule of law. And that's how you get big government. So for example, from the explicit power given to the president to appoint and receive ambassadors flows the implied authority to recognize foreign governments and conduct diplomacy with other countries generally. From the commander-in-chief clause flows powers to use military force and collect foreign intelligence. You get the idea. So yes, the government started with a great deal of authority over foreign policy at the federal level, but don't think they haven't still managed to overstep that authority that was given to them. Let's take a deeper dive into what our foreign policy looked like between our inception and now, as well as the major policy and legal decisions that got us here. First, I want to talk about my favorite war. Yes, I have a favorite war. The Revolution. Have you ever met those older men that are just like amped on wars? Like they can tell you about every battle that had ever occurred in this war that they didn't even live through. And you can tell that they're just like fascinated by the strategy of war. And to be honest, I try to humor them, but my eyes usually glaze over a little bit, but not with the Revolution. When I think about the American Revolution, I get very emotional very quickly. You know that song in Hamilton when they sing like, "We won!" And then they sing "The world turned upside down"? That slays me every time. I'm tearing up just talking about it. I get so emotional about it because how could you not get hype about this? The war is awful and tragic, and it should be avoided at all costs. But when it comes to the American Revolution, it was this wrench thrown into the bowels of history that stopped the gears and reversed the march of time towards the powerful and the collective. It truly did turn the world upside down. And with our hard-fought and unlikely victory, liberty finally had this threshold in the world, and with that footing, it advanced rapidly. So I get amped about this. We unfortunately don't have time to discuss all of the events that led up to the American Revolution, but I've linked a really cool timeline in my show notes if you're interested. Instead, I'm going to basically summarize here. Here's how it goes. The British were impudent, plain and simple. They just would not stop spying on us, telling us where we could move, trying us without judges, taxing us, making us house their soldiers, and even killing us during the Boston Massacre. In other words, they had it coming. And yes, I think I am starting a new trend to see how many like showbiz references I can work into each episode. I'm at 2 right now, Chicago and Hamilton. So finally, the colonists rise up. And this is what I love so much about Americans. This mess around and find out attitude that so many people on the left these days want to stomp out, right? They don't like this individual liberty thing. I see people mocking it all the time, and they don't like people who are ungovernable. But we have this streak deep in us, and I think that I would almost fear that sentiment on the left, except for the fact that I know it's in our blood, man. Americans will only take so much before they rise up, and when we do, we're scrappy. So all of that to say, the Brits weren't ready. We started throwing tea in the harbor. We burned their patrol ships. We stopped importing and selling their merch. It's game on. Patrick Henry gives his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. And on April 18th of 1775, Paul Revere rides through the night yelling, "The British are coming!" And he wakes up the nation to fight. I love it. It's such a good story. What you may not remember is that this is a very long war, though. We fight from 1775 to 1783, which is 8 years, and we shouldn't have won. It was improbable. It was against all odds. We were outnumbered, outspent, our people were untrained, and we were fighting what was at the time one of the greatest military powers in history. But we won, and you should never forget that. It does not take a majority to win. Every odd can be stacked against you, but a small, committed minority can always win, still can. After we won, we immediately struggled to determine what our foreign policy should look like. We struggled to maintain necessary commercial ties with Europe without becoming embroiled in European conflicts and politics, and the differences on this subject between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton led to the formation of our first 2 political parties, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. But George Washington, who to this day I think remains one of our wisest presidents, ultimately declared neutrality in the conflicts between Britain, France, and Spain. The Jay Treaty with Britain of 1794 and the, let's see if I can say this, Picquet Treaty with Spain in 1795 aimed at preserving this neutrality. And in his farewell address, Washington promoted a vision of American diplomacy that involved no entangling alliances with European powers. He also said we should watch out for political parties. Yeah, can't emphasize that enough. He said watch out, okay? Let's keep that noted. Notably, many of the Founding Fathers held views that today would be referred to as isolationist by neocons. They believed in open trade and commerce between nations, but were staunchly against involving ourselves in the political affairs or conflicts of other countries. I actually think this worldview should be referred to as non-interventionist, as that's a more accurate description. People who believe in free trade are, by definition, not isolationist. Anyways, in his first inaugural address, which was in 1801, Thomas Jefferson spoke of peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Benjamin Franklin summed up his point when he wrote, "A virgin state should preserve its virgin character and not go suitoring for alliances, but wait with decent dignity for the application of others." John Quincy Adams famously proclaimed, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." James Madison said, "Of all of the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it compromises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies, from those proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. God, that's so important. We should read more from our founders. They really knew what was up. And lastly, Washington argued the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is to have with them as little political, as distinct from commercial, connection as possible. And basically, for the majority of the 1800s, we basically followed the Founding Fathers' warnings. We kept it neutral when it came to conflicts. We had open borders for immigrants. We traded freely with others, and we blossomed. We lived in peace. We grew economically, and we became a place people wanted to be. To this end, the Monroe Doctrine was articulated by President James Monroe in 1823, and it guided our foreign policy for nearly 100 years. It essentially said that the U.S. would take a non-interventionist approach, and it warned European powers not to attempt further colonization or otherwise interfere in the Western Hemisphere, stating that the United States would view any such interference as a potentially hostile act. Basically, leave us alone, and we will leave you alone. Such a novel concept. And I'm skipping over some minor conflicts in our first 90 years for time, but I've linked a good overview in the show notes if you're really that interested. All in all, there was nothing major or substantial for me to report on. Then, of course, in 1861 comes the first major conflict after the Revolutionary War, which was the Civil War. And this war was, of course, a war that we fought against ourselves over slavery, westward expansion, and states' rights. And here's how it kind of went down. Upon the election of known abolitionist Abraham Lincoln, 7 states seceded from the Union in 1860, which it must be pointed out they should have had the right to do. The U.S. was intended to be a loose association of many nations that choose to partake in the Union. Were they disgusting and wrong for why they chose to succeed? Yeah, screw those guys. Awful people. But should states have the right to leave the U.S. if the federal government overreaches? Also, yes. And this is a debate we're still having to this day. I'm fully on the side of us being able to pull back if the federal government gets out of line. Anyways, while the South called the war of Northern aggression, it was actually the South that fired first. And on June 25th of 1861, Congress enacted a resolution declaring that the Civil War was being fought to preserve the Union. Notably, they did not say it was being fought to abolish the South's peculiar institution of slavery. I don't know why I think this matters to point out. I think it stands out to me because almost every war in our history has been fought over an altruistic reason on the surface. And obviously slavery was a good reason to go to war for most people. But underneath, there's always more nefarious reasons behind the scenes for why the government actually wants to go to war. And to a large degree, my opinion of this war is exactly the same. It's actually not until January 1st of 1863, 3 years into the conflict, and with the Union taking a beating, that Lincoln finally issues the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are henceforth shall be freed. So notably, this proclamation only applied to states that had seceded from the United States, leaving slavery untouched in the loyal border states, which is just mind-blowing to me. But regardless of the purity of Lincoln's sentiments, which I find questionable, this proclamation did rally people to the cause of the Union, and it turned the war around, right? They were kind of losing. This proclamation comes out. People are galvanized around it. This is a moral thing that we should be fighting. And the war ends in 1865. But it leaves the nation in shambles. Over 600,000 people were dead, and the cost of the war put us into significant debt. Now, the money is what I think is actually kind of significant here, and what happened and continues to happen to our money is closely tied to our military interventions. So a couple things to note. On August 5th, 1861, President Lincoln imposed the first federal income tax by signing the Revenue Act to pay for the war. Next, the government passed the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which allowed for the printing of greenbacks and for the government to sell bonds to raise money, ultimately paving the path for us to move away from the gold standard. So it's starting to mess with our currency. Third, Lincoln created the National Bank Act of 1863, which allowed for the creation of a nationwide banking system that loaned money to the government to pay for the war. These are big deals that have really long-reaching effects in our society. Like, in my opinion, like as far as money and currency goes, it starts really going downhill from here. The government starts taking a lot of control over the money. For the next couple of decades after the Civil War, America mostly focused on rebuilding itself. Like I said, they were in shambles. There's some treaties. There's a lot of diplomatic negotiations. There's a few avoided conflicts, but we're still mostly on the good foot when it comes to carrying out the foreign policy that our founders intended. all the way up until 1913, we're pretty much practicing diplomacy, and honestly, at times, impressive diplomacy. Like, Teddy Roosevelt personally led negotiations that ended a war between Japan and Russia that we weren't even in. Like, he just popped in, saved the day, got a Nobel Peace Prize, and left. Great. I'd love to see that energy in a modern-day president. But Roosevelt also developed what was known as the Roosevelt Corollary Doctrine to the Monroe Doctrine. And this essentially said that the U.S. would intervene as a last resort to ensure that other nations in the Western Hemisphere fulfilled their obligations to international creditors and did not violate the rights of the United States or invite foreign aggression to the detriment of the entire body of American nations. Again, you see that money and military conflict just continuing to weave together. So we're starting to see a little interventionism slipping in. And then comes Woodrow Wilson, who I just don't think we trash nearly enough. What a monster. Wilson preferred to characterize his foreign interventions as being in the best interest of the particular Latin American nation involved at the time. Often, that conveniently mirrored U.S. commercial interest. And such was the case in revolutionary Mexico, where American investors, mainly oil companies, owned over 40% of the nation's property. And Wilson felt Mexico and her neighbors needed to be properly directed towards stability. So he sent in our troops. But in early 1917, Wilson pulled the troops out of Mexico for an even greater act of intervention that he said would make the world a safer place for democracy. And the U.S. entered World War I. Notice it's always for democracy and stability and to make the world safe when we go to war. On April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. Wilson cited Germany's violation of its pledge to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, as well as its attempts to entice Mexico into an alliance against the United States. And these were his reasons that the U.S. should declare war. And they give him his way. Congress declares war. By 1918, Americans were reeling from the emotional and financial cost of war and began to feel as though joining the war effort was a mistake. In 1918, Wilson articulated his 14 points to help end the war and establish a basis for cooperation, which set the stage for what would later become known as the League of Nations, which he then couldn't garner enough support for us to join. So embarrassing. Warren Harding won the 1920 presidential election on the promise of staying out of global affairs and by arguing that the United States needed normalcy and to focus on internal problems. The 1920s and 1930s sees the U.S. return to a strategy of non-interventionism. The American people had gotten their first taste of a big foreign conflict, and they did not like it. The Kellogg-Briet Act is passed in 1928, which was an agreement to outlaw war. It was kind of a peace treaty, if you will. And in 1934, a U.S. Senate committee known as the Nye Committee forms to investigate the financial and banking interests that underlie the United States involvement in World War I and the operations and profits of the industrial and commercial firms supplying munitions to the Allies and to the United States. The committee documented the huge profits that arms factories had made during the war, and it also found that bankers had pressured Woodrow Wilson to intervene in the war in order to protect their loans abroad. Sounds familiar. Because of these facts, Senator Nye, many war critics, and members of the American public concluded that the U.S. entered the war for reasons of profit, not policy, because it was in the interest of American banks and investors for the Allies not to lose so that they would be able to pay the interest and principal on their loans. Many Americans felt betrayed and questioned the narrative that the war had been an epic battle between the forces of good, democracy, and evil, autocracy, as it had been depicted in pro-war propaganda. The investigation of these merchants of death, I think that's a great term, we should keep that going, helped to bolster sentiments favoring neutrality, non-interventionism, disarmament, and taking the profits out of weapons procurements. This sentiment led to Congress passing a series of neutrality laws in the latter 1930s that forbade American businesses from loaning money to, selling war materials to, or carrying goods abroad, American ships, to nations at war. It also meant that the American people were not into entering World War II when it broke out in 1939. But by the late 1930s, our favorite nemesis, FDR, is in office, and he wants to go to war. He gives some impassioned speeches, he's trying to rile people up, but the Americans are still like, no, hard pass. And at first, Roosevelt proclaimed U.S. neutrality while doing what he could to assist the French and the British behind the scenes. In 1939, the president persuaded Congress to pass the Cash and Carry Amendment to the earlier, tougher neutrality laws, preventing the U.S. from getting any materials to the Allies. So he was able to start sending some things their ways. On September 16, 1940, the United States instituted the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, which required all men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for a draft. This was the first peacetime draft in United States history, but it certainly would not be the last. In 1941, Roosevelt goes and meets with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and he signs this thing called the Atlantic Charter, which was a most remarkable step for a neutral nation, because the charter outlined America's overall attachment to the ideal of self-determination and freedom, but more pointedly declared that the disarmament of aggressor nations is essential. The leaders signed the charter in August, the same month that a poll showed that less than 20% of the American people supported entering the war. But finally, and most conveniently for Roosevelt, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor a mere 4 months later. One day after the attack, the U.S. declared war on Japan. 4 days after that, Hitler declared war on the U.S. in a move that many consider to be one of his strategic downfalls. And that's how we end up in World War II. And while the U.S. was fighting what I think was a true existential threat during this time, which is the only time that I believe we're justified in going to war, it's important to remember it wasn't all rah-rah democracy and rainbows on our side either. We had camps of our own, Japanese internment camps, as we discussed in our last episode on immigration. We blocked thousands of Jewish people from coming here and sent them to their deaths. And we dropped the only nuclear bombs in history. Our soldiers raped women overseas, around 4,500, we believe, actually. And I want to be crystal clear here, because this actually makes me really mad. When the subject of foreign policy comes up, I often hear people just a little bit older than me, it's mostly generations a little bit of me, claim that when we go to war, we should do it like we did in Japan. Basically insinuating that when we go to war, we should replicate dropping a bomb and wiping out whole cities when we have a conflict. That is psychotic. That is psychotic. I know that this is a hotly debated topic, but there is a lot of evidence that indicates we could have won this war without dropping those bombs. After the Soviets entered the war, the Japanese were looking for a way out. They knew they couldn't fight on two fronts. And ample intelligence shows that Truman, who was president at that time, and his advisors knew it. While a majority of Americans may not be familiar with this history, the National Museum of the U.S. Navy in Washington, D.C. actually states unambiguously on a plaque with the atomic bombs exhibit that the vast destruction wreaked by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the loss of 135,000 people made little impact on the Japanese military. However, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria changed their minds. But online, the wording has been slightly modified to put the atomic bombings in more positive light because the victors ultimately get to write history. But we didn't need to do this, and we knew it. To back me up on this, 7 of the United States' 8 five-star Army and Navy officers in 1945 agreed with the Navy's assessment. They were Generals Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, and Henry Hap Arnold, Admirals William Leahy, Chester Nimitz, Ernest King, and William Halsey. They're all on record stating that the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. No one was more impassioned in his condemnation than Leahy, who was Truman's chief of staff. He wrote in his memoir that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. In being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. War sucks. And even when we do have a case to be made for joining one, it is without question that we have not done so in ethical ways that uphold our values, both for the people we have attacked and in what we do to take care of our own military members. The rest of World War II is history that I think feels pretty settled and that most people are pretty familiar with. The Allied powers won the war, they took out the demonic Nazis, and they formed a series of significant treaties. The United Nations is formed. We get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Basically, the Allies are committed to ensuring we never see such a scour on the face of the earth again. and our attention thereafter turns to what is known as containment. We begin to focus on preventing the spread of communism so that another existential war would theoretically never need to be fought again. The Truman Doctrine is passed in 1947, under which President Harry Truman pledged to contain the communist uprisings in Greece and Turkey. More generally, the Truman Doctrine implied American support for other nations that they thought to be threatened by Soviet communism. Truman also got the National Security Act passed in September of 1947, which gave birth to the CIA. And these policies and agencies formed under the guise of national security. But we know from other episodes that we've looked into that they've mostly been used against our own people, as we discussed in our privacy episode. So you can go back and check that out if you need to. But beginning in 1947, we entered into what is known as the Cold War. And here is a good summary from Wikipedia on that time in our history. The Civil War was a period of geopolitical division between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. Historians do not fully agree on its starting and ending points, but the period is generally considered to span the 1947 Truman Doctrine to the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union. The term Cold War is used because there was no large-scale fighting directly between the two superpowers, but they each supported major regional conflicts known as proxy wars. The conflict was based around the ideological and geopolitical struggle for global influence by these two superpowers, following their temporary alliance and victory against Nazi Germany in 1945. Aside from the nuclear arsenal development and the conventional military deployments, the struggle for dominance was expressed via indirect means such as psychological warfare, propaganda campaigns, espionage, far-reaching embargoes, rivalry at sporting events, and technological competitions such as the space race. The Cold War can best be described as a period of paranoia. It's often referred to as the Red Scare in our history. And look, I hate communism much more than your average bloke. I think it's a disgusting, immoral, and deadly ideology that has killed more people than any other in recent memory. But I would argue that the U.S. went so far in its hatred of communism that it kind of started to become what it stood against, which was collectivist, authoritarian, and an impediment to civil liberties and individual rights. During the Red Scare, federal employees were analyzed to determine whether they were sufficiently loyal to the government, and the House Un-American Activities Committee, as well as the U.S. Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, investigated allegations of subversive elements in the government and the Hollywood film industry. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was frankly a maniac, was quick to equate any kind of protest with communist subversion, including the civil rights demonstrations led by Martin Luther King Jr. Hoover labeled King a communist and covertly worked to intimidate and discredit the civil rights leader. And under the Cold War era, we began a foreign policy tradition that saw us partake in regime change, proxy wars, entering unconstitutional wars that were never voted on, and manipulating conflicts through funding and supplies. If you know anything about our current circumstances, you know where all this ends up. I'll briefly go through some of the major events. Sorry to you history buffs who were hoping for a play-by-play. You almost got it. I got sucked in while researching this, and I was this close to being one of those old men who wants to talk to you all about these random war battles, but for time's sake, I'm going to speed it up. So, in 1950, we entered the Korean War, which my grandfather fought in. It was the first military action under the Cold War, and the first time we entered a major foreign conflict without a declaration of war. Yep, here we go. Basically, the Korean War was a civil war in Korea that the U.S. decided to insert itself in. And this conflict became a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which each were kind of backing the side that it believed upheld its views. In 1957, President Eisenhower passes the Eisenhower Doctrine, which said a country could request American economic assistance or aid from U.S. military forces if it was being threatened by armed aggression from another state. Essentially, this was our way of saying, if you're having a battle with communists, let us know. We got you. We'll fund that. But in his farewell address of 1961, Eisenhower, who was a retired five-star Army general and the man who led the Allies on D-Day, gave the nation a dire warning about what he described as a threat to democratic government. He called it the military-industrial complex. He was the first to use that term. And he described this as a formidable union of defense contractors and armed forces. Eisenhower was reportedly worried about the cost of an arms race with the Soviet Union and the resources it would take from other areas, like building hospitals and schools. And he also spoke as someone who had seen the horrors of war and wanted to avoid them. And he was concerned about the possibility that as the military and the arms industry gained power, they would be a threat to democracy that civilians would end up losing control to. And essentially, we've basically seen that happen. Now we're in the 1960s, and here comes Kennedy. His brief time in office continues the strategy of containment, but poorly. First, Kennedy gave the green light to an Eisenhower initiative, which was an invasion of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba in 1961. Based on faulty intelligence, the military action, which was carried out by Cuban exiles without crucial air support, was a fiasco, a huge national embarrassment. And then he had a series of other blunders. He looked really weak in a meeting with Soviet Premier Khrushchev. He ran his mouth in Berlin, and the Soviets built the Berlin Wall in response. And then he kind of dabbled in regime change in Vietnam. The Kennedy administration actually approved the overthrow of President Diem there, basically believing that any successor in government would have to be an improvement. But they were wrong, as we've mostly been wrong when we've protected regime change. When Kennedy is assassinated and Lyndon B. Johnson takes over, LBJ's top priority becomes escalating the situation in Vietnam. On August 7th, 1964, Congress passes what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and this authorized LBJ to take any measure he believed necessary to retaliate and to promote the maintenance of international peace and security in Southeast Asia. So we don't declare war in Vietnam yet again. Instead, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution basically authorized the escalation and the use of military forces in what became one of our worst conflicts in history. So you see this trend starting to build, right? This was yet again another civil war with a country that the U.S. inserted itself in, and it was doomed. By 1968, the United States had 548,000 troops in Vietnam and had already lost 30,000 Americans there. We were losing, but LBJ saw no way out, and so he just kept continuing it. Vietnam saw the draft reinstated, of course. We saw 60,000 Americans die ultimately, and it was one of the most unpopular wars in American history, leading to a full-fledged anti-war movement that rose up around it. A beleaguered LBJ stepped aside after only one elected term, and Nixon won the presidency in 1968. Nixon initially tried to expand the war, actually, by sending troops into Cambodia. And this led to a huge outcry from the anti-war movement in the U.S., particularly by students at Kent State in Ohio. In response to the students' protests at Kent State in Ohio, the government sent in the National Guard troops to the school's campus in May of 1970 and gunned them down. They gunned down American students who were protesting more. Like, this country, man. It's wild. Finally, the conflict ends in 1975 and the U.S. loses. Oof. In 1973, Congress passes the War Powers Resolution Act, and this is a congressional resolution designed to limit the U.S. president's ability to initiate or escalate military actions abroad. But, it does the opposite. The solution says the president can only send in the U.S. armed forces by declaration of a war by Congress, by statutory authorization, or in case of a national emergency created by an attack on the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. And wouldn't you know it, just about every conflict we've entered since then has been under this resolution. It is weird how we just keep having national emergencies by which the president can authorize troops under this act. It's weird. So, just to be sure you're tracking, the U.S. has not declared war as we are supposed to do under the U.S. Constitution since World War II. Libya, Syria, Yemen, Iran, all carried out under the War Powers Resolution. Anyways, as you know, Watergate takes out Nixon in 1973, and he is replaced by his Vice President Ford, who is then replaced by Jimmy Carter, and they're both pretty milquetoast. Again, I've linked the minor things that were going on under both of their tenures in my show notes, but there's nothing really worth spending a lot of time on here. And that brings us to the modern era. I'm going to group the 1980s through present times because I think they are inextricably attached. Now, I have to pause here and tell my mom to plug her ears because she adores Ronald Reagan, and it hurts her feelings when I tell the truth about him. And that's this. Reagan is kind of a mixed bag. He was neither as great as Republicans would have you believe or as terrible as Democrats might say. On foreign policy, I think he was more good than bad, but let's go through it. Because Reagan was hugely impactful on the GOP in his next 40 years, and decisions he made on foreign policy still have ripple effects throughout modern times. Reagan was heavily focused on taking down communism, which he viewed as an evil ideology. I would agree. He believed in peace through strength, and he was committed to peace for people all over the world, what's known as the Reagan Doctrine. And this sounds great in theory. And therein lies the power of Reagan, right? He said all of the right things, but he didn't always live up to those ideals that he espoused. And that's where people get a little confused. For one example, despite claiming to be all about limited government, Reagan really increased the funding of the military-industrial complex. During Reagan's administration, the size of the U.S. Army grew by 2 active divisions and saw the development of new weapon systems. Reagan gave military spending priority over his promise of a balanced budget, telling his advisors, "Defense is not a budget issue. You spend what you need," and spend they did. While the Carter administration and the Democratic Congress greatly increased the defense budget in the late 1970s, Reagan set the price tag at $220 billion, which was the largest peacetime military budget in history at that point. Reagan focused his attention primarily on Latin America and the Soviet Union throughout his tenure, overseeing multiple smaller conflicts in the regions. And while he believed in peace through strength, the whole containment strategy was kind of out the window with Reagan. He was really more about undermining, strangling, and cooing communism out. In the early 1980s, he suffered the Iran-Contra scandal. And this was a secret U.S. arms deal that traded missiles and other arms to free some American hostages that were held by terrorists in Lebanon, but also used those funds from the arms deal to support armed conflict in Nicaragua. I don't have time to fully flesh that out, but again, linked in show notes. Just know he was being messy. We were funding different sides of conflicts in the Middle East. We were supplying weapons. We were participating in regime change. And it begins to lead to problems, and specifically to blowback against our citizens. But while Reagan made many blunders in the foreign policy department, he did avoid major conflict during the height of the Cold War, and his diplomacy and meetings with Russian leader Gorbachev ultimately did lead to a peace treaty signed under his predecessor, George H. Bush. In December 1988, at the very end of Reagan's presidency, Gorbachev announced in an address to the United Nations in Washington that he would unilaterally reduce Soviet military forces in Eastern Europe by 500,000 soldiers and 10,000 tanks over the next 2 years. In 1991, President George H. Bush and Gorbachev signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, effectively bringing the Cold War to a close, finally. As a predecessor, H. Bush continued many of Reagan's foreign policies, and it is for this that I actually think Reagan deserves more blame than what actually happened while he was in charge, because sometimes it takes a while to see the results of policies. But under H. Bush, things start to go off the rails, man. I'd like to tell you a brief story that I think is so indicative of U.S. foreign policy. While the U.S. was trying to stop communism during the Cold War in Latin America, the CIA relied on this informant, Manuel Noriega, in Panama. And this was during the time that H. Bush was actually leading the CIA. That guy goes rogue, becomes a drug kingpin, becomes a military dictator, and takes over the country. So one of H. Bush's first military interventions is invading Panama to take out the guy that he positioned in the first place. Like, LOL. That intervention violated international law and was denounced by the Organization of American States and the United Nations, but we got him. And then comes the Persian Gulf War. Dum. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded its neighbor Kuwait. Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq at the time, had long held designs on Kuwait's land, their wealth, and their oil. And although intelligence agencies had watched Iraqi's military build up along its border with Kuwait, both the United States and Iraq's Arab neighbors did not believe that Hussein had plans to invade this small country to its south. But they misread Hussein's intentions. The invasion violated international law, and the Bush administration was alarmed at the prospect of Iraq controlling Kuwait's oil resources. So here we go. I hope you've got your seatbelt on. Click it in, okay? Doesn't stop from here on out. On January 12, 1990, Congress narrowly voted to authorize the use of military force against Iraq. They go in, it's called Operation Desert Storm, begins on January 17, 1991. And this is when U.S.-led coalition forces begin this massive airstrike against Iraq. The coalition launched the ground war on February 24th, and it quickly overwhelmed the Iraqi forces. Coalition troops reached Kuwait City by February 27th, and a ceasefire was declared the next day. So this goes down really quickly. Why did we involve ourselves in a conflict between Kuwait and Iraq? Great question. Again, I think the only answer is oil and money. And while we won that round, that wouldn't be the last of that particular conflict. The war also caused the price of oil to skyrocket. It led to a recession, and it caused Hussein to declare jihad on U.S. forces. Great, here we go. H. Bush loses his second term to Clinton in an election that saw independent candidate Ross Perot get 19% of the vote. That's the most any independent has ever received, and you best believe that they fixed the system to prevent that from ever happening again. Clinton gets into office, and he does a lot more domestically than he does internationally. There was a lot going on at home. The major foreign policy trouble spots during his 2 terms were in Africa and Eastern Europe, but nothing super important over there. Clinton also tried to resolve long-running conflicts in Northern Ireland and the Middle East, particularly the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, to no avail. Didn't go right. During the Clinton administration, the United States remained a target for international terrorists with bomb attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City in 1993, on U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, and on the U.S. Navy in Yemen in 2000. In December 1998, Clinton, citing Iraqi noncompliance with UN resolutions and weapons inspections, ordered a 4-day bombing campaign against Iraq. The military action prompted Iraq to halt further weapons inspections. And that brings us up to W. Bush. Obviously, W. Bush doesn't have time to do much before 9/11 hits on September 11th of 2001. Bush immediately responds, calling for a global war on terrorism in response to the attacks, and identified exiled Saudi millionaire and terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden as the primary suspect in the acts. Of the 9/11 hijackers, 15 of them were citizens of Saudi Arabia, 2 were from the United Arab Emirates, 1 was from Lebanon, and 1 was from Egypt. But we went to war in Afghanistan. It makes sense if you just don't think about it whatsoever. Today, 20 years later, we know Saudi officials were behind these attacks, and we know our leaders knew that. According to reporting by The Guardian, immediately after the attacks, the Bush administration downplayed the Saudi connection and suppressed evidence that might link powerful Saudis to the funding of Islamic extremism and terrorism. The Bush White House didn't want to upset its relationship with one of the world's largest oil-producing nations, which was also an American ally with enormous political influence in Washington, and much of what the FBI discovered about possible Saudi links to the attack remains secret even today. Families of 9/11 victims have launched a massive lawsuit in federal court in Manhattan. They also believe that senior Saudi officials were complicit in the attacks. They were blocked for 15 years from even bringing their claims to court because of the sovereign immunity protection for foreign governments in court. In 2016, Congress overrode a veto by President Barack Obama, that's right, he vetoed it, to clear the way for the lawsuit by approving the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. Lawyers for the family have now collected some 11,000 still secret pages of internal documents from the U.S. government and have deposed numerous Saudi witnesses to determine what they knew of the hijackers' plot, bolstering what they say is a trail of connections leading back to Saudi Arabia's capital. In September, the Saudi government issued a statement of innocence. Yeah, right. So if you're one of those people, as I was, who was emotionally manipulated into supporting W's wars, it's okay. They talked a good game about freedom and democracy and westernization, but it was never about those things. It wasn't even about vengeance or justice. If it had been, we would have gone after the Saudis, our allies, who we give a ton of money and support to, and who are genocidal maniacs and one of the biggest perpetrators of terrorism in the modern world. I promise you, our government does not care about terrorism or human rights. That's not what this is about. This is what they tell you when they want to garner your support to go after what they want to do for other reasons. So, back to the timeline. In September of 2001, Congress passes the Authorization for Use of Military Force in Afghanistan, with all members of Congress voting in favor except one, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She's still in office. She kind of rocks. She's a Democrat, but I like her. I can rock with her. The authorization granted the president the authority to use all necessary and appropriate force against those whom he determined planned, authorized, committed, or aided the September 11th attacks, or who harbored said persons or groups. So we see that Congress is basically just delegating their powers to one person under this act. It's completely unconstitutional. It's completely just turning our foundations on their head. Also, we begin torturing people on a nearby island at this point, many of whom never had even the slightest connections to Al-Qaeda. We ramped up spying against the American people in the name of national defense. We grossly expanded the federal government and violated the UN Charter and the Geneva Conventions. It goes on. I mean, USA. So dumb. If you want to go even more in depth here, there is a great docuseries on Netflix called Turning Points that I highly recommend. Moving forward, though, I think what's notable about this war and those that followed in the Middle East is it started out under this pro-war propaganda that assured the American people the step was necessary to protect the homeland from future invaders. But within a few years even, the tune changed to spreading democracy and teaching the country to prop up Western government, which was very similar talking points to the kind of paternalistic talking points used by FDR and Woodrow Wilson back in the day. Again, they always make this sound altruistic. Though we had not yet captured bin Laden, the U.S. turns its attention back to Iraq just a few years after we invade Afghanistan. In March of 2003, the U.S. invades Iraq, vowing to destroy Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and end the dictatorial rule of Saddam Hussein, which we do in yet another instance of regime change. But by 2005, the CIA's top weapons inspector in Iraq said the hunt for weapons of mass destruction has gone as far as feasible and has found nothing. We're still there. We are still there. Like, they never found a single weapon of mass destruction, and yet we're still there. It's been almost 20 years. We just left Afghanistan this summer, which is another war you can put a big L in our column for, as the Taliban immediately took over, even seizing millions of dollars worth of our equipment in the process. Like, we not only are destroying our own country through these wars, we're not even good at winning them. In Afghanistan, 77,000 military actors were killed, 47,000 civilians were killed, and 51,000 oppositional forces were killed. Hundreds of thousands of people died in Iraq. We spent over $2 trillion on these wars. These were just giant catastrophes. And I think so few Americans care because it didn't happen here in your homeland and you could forget about what was happening. But the loss of life, the catastrophic numbers of people we killed, the human rights violations we carried out over the past 20 years, and the money that we spend should get your attention because it's disgusting. We killed and tortured innocent people by the thousands. You can't just wash your hands of that. You are complicit if you're not speaking out against this. And it's still going on. Because I don't want to leave the blame solely on W. Bush for these wars, though he certainly deserves a lot of it, let's briefly go over Obama and Trump. Obama ran on ending the existing wars, but he ended up just entrenching us further in them. The power vacuum that was created by taking out Saddam Hussein led to the formation of ISIS and destabilization of the Middle East. And it's amazing how we just keep creating our own enemies to go fight. This, of course, accelerates the Syrian war and unspeakable humanitarian crises there while Obama is in office, which to his credit, he resisted the urge for us to fully enter that conflict, but we have been fighting there in a proxy capacity for some time. We drop a ton of bombs there. Like, it's not like we washed our hands of it. I also think Obama deserves credit for negotiating the Iran nuclear deal and for easing the embargo against Cuba. But unfortunately, those are about the only nice things I can say about his administration. Obama drastically expanded air wars and increased the use of special operations forces around the globe. In 2016, U.S. special operators could be found in 70% of the world's nations, 138 countries. That was a jump of 130% since the days of the Bush administration. In 2016 alone, the Obama administration dropped at least 26,171 bombs. This means that every day of 2016, the U.S. military dropped 72 bombs. That's 3 bombs every hour. And while most of these air attacks were in Syria and Iraq, U.S. bombs also dropped in Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan. His administration bombed hospitals, weddings, and children. They carried out one of the most oppressive persecutions of whistleblowers. Under Obama's administration, more people were investigated and prosecuted for leaks than under all other U.S. presidents combined. It's crazy. Journalists were harried to rat out their sources until then Attorney General Eric Holder finally conceded that reporters should not be punished for just doing their jobs. A former assistant inspector general in the Pentagon disclosed that far from being protected when using official channels, National Security Agency whistleblowers were subject to retaliation and punishment, making Edward Snowden's decision to go straight to the media a very wise one. The insider threat program implemented by Obama further dried up sources of even unclassified information because it required federal officers to report on each other's suspicious behavior. Under Obama's administration were the crucial revelations of Edward Snowden, which I covered in the privacy episode, and of Chelsea Manning via WikiLeaks. Briefly, since this is new material for the show, Chelsea Manning is a veteran who revealed war crimes that she discovered during the course of her service. She provided WikiLeaks, a media source, with the video called Collateral Murder, which showed the U.S. Army killing a dozen unarmed civilians, including 2 Reuters employees. You can go watch this video. I don't understand how so few people know about this, what we were doing. We were committing war crimes. Snowden was aggressively pursued by the Obama administration and backed into a corner in Russia when then Vice President Biden essentially trapped him. According to Snowden, the administration persecuted international citizens who housed him during his time in Hong Kong as well. Manning, who came back to the States, was tried and sentenced to 35 years, which was the longest ever sentence given to anyone for the offenses that she carried out. In prison, she was isolated, tortured, abused, and committed numerous suicide attempts. Obama did officially pardon her a little bit later on after she'd been in prison for some time, but while she was there, she had numerous suicide attempts, was isolated, and even tortured. Obama also destabilized Libya by again partaking in regime change with the assassination of Gaddafi. This further empowered ISIS and made the region substantially less safe, making it a breeding ground for slavery and human trafficking. Can you believe that this guy has a peace prize? It just blows my mind. It's just a really good reminder that degrees and rank and awards don't mean that much, okay? They don't mean that much. On to Trump. Trump also came into office promising to end Bush's wars, but was similarly sidetracked. It's almost like they don't have that much control as we like to think that they do. Trump surrounded himself with warmongers like John Bolton, General James Mad Dog Mattis, Mike Flynn, Steve Bannon, Mike Pompeo. And this was just a huge heads up to me early on that his whole America First talk and promises to end the wars were probably just fluff. If you're truly anti-war, you don't put these guys in your inner circle, okay? And far from delivering the peace he promised, Trump actually doubled down on the worst of Obama's policies, particularly in regard to the nation's covert and proxy wars, which would be in Libya, Syria, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen. Trump actually increased the number of troops in Afghanistan instead of pulling them out like he said he would. He relied heavily on bombings there with a record 7,423 bombs and missiles dropped in 2019. Both Obama and Trump also sold the very repressive and problematic Saudi dictatorship so many U.S. weapons that for 3 years, the Saudis' military spending exceeded every country in the world except the United States and China. We are not concerned about terrorism. We are funding it on all sides. We've got all sides equipped with our guns. That's what's happening. Honestly, I'm just scratching the surface here. Again, there's more links in my show notes if you really want to go down the rabbit hole. It's just depressing. It's a very depressing rabbit hole. But I will say this, we avoided a new major conflict under Trump, which given his temperament, the war hawks he surrounded himself with, and the military-industrial complex's current gunning for war with China or Russia, is worth noting. And I believe, and will always believe, we have Rand Paul to thank for that. Had Rand not strategically positioned himself as an ally to Trump and gained his trust, these men almost certainly would have gotten their way and talked Trump into more foreign conflicts than he already got us into. It's not like he's an ideologue or especially principled guy. He was really very easily influenced by those around him and by the media. So the small group of exhausting people in the liberty movement who just constantly harp on Rand for not being principled enough can miss me with that, because I am very confident that had it not been for Rand playing chess as he did, we most certainly would have been in another conflict thanks to all those other buffoons that were surrounding him. So the lesson you should have learned here is that it doesn't matter what they say in their campaign promises or their talking points or their tweets. They are all the same, and they have been for decades. The war machine just marches on and on. As someone once said, we vote and we vote and we vote, and somehow we just keep getting John McCain. I could not say better. I can't remember who said it. Again, let me know in the comments if you know. I know I'm just blanking here. Great quote. For many years, it was seen as fringe to be anti-war, and that's because the neocons had control of both parties, a media that sided with them. The media loves war, don't you ever forget it. And they had the fear of the American people, which is very powerful. Back in 2007, Rudy Giuliani was America's mayor. Like, he was beloved. He had been this really aggressive prosecutor back in New York that really went after the mafia. And then he'd become the mayor of New York City, and he was mayor during the 9/11 attacks. We now know that Rudy Giuliani is a total quack. Like, the guy's off his rocker. But people didn't know that back then. At the time, he was this front runner for president, largely based on his very pro-war stances. And in a presidential debate, a lesser-known congressman from Texas, Ron Paul, sparred with Giuliani over foreign policy. And people were shook. No one, and I mean no one, had dared to go after this sacred cow of war until then. And there was this strongly held belief that America's foreign policy decisions had been moral and upright, that they had been correct and strategic, and that they had made us safe, and that they had even made the rest of the world safe. And there was this notion that to criticize war was to criticize our troops, and that was just unthinkable at the time. So when Ron Paul alleged that our own military actions overseas had caused the attacks on our homeland, it really rattled people. I don't think I've ever heard that before, and I've heard some pretty absurd explanations for September 11th, Giuliani said to wild applause from the audience during that debate. But though Paul had voted for the AUMF in Afghanistan, he quickly came to regret that vote. And by the time the whole weapons of mass destruction bid came along for Iraq in 2003, he was staunchly opposed. By 2007, when this debate happens, when he went up against Rudy Giuliani, he had developed a deeply held of beliefs around this topic, and he was ready for that challenge. And though Paul's ideas were unpopular at the time, they were right. And by sticking to his guns, he really forced the nation to begin critically thinking about our foreign policy. And his interaction with Rudy Giuliani actually did knock the latter out of top contender status. Thank God for our nation that man did not become president. People don't turn themselves into human bombs and launch themselves into buildings because they hate the freedom of others. That is one of the stupidest explanations I've ever heard. They do that in retaliation and when they themselves believe that they are being oppressed. And you know what? They were. We've never been in the right in the Middle East. We have killed millions of people, many of them citizens. We've tortured people. We've split up families. We've killed children. We've created power vacuums. We've armed and created the very terrorist groups we now fight. We've upset people's way of life, a world away from our own. We've created destruction and destitution and death. I would hate us too if I were in their shoes. If somebody bombed a hospital with my baby in it, if somebody captured and killed my father because bad intelligence told them he was a terrorist, if someone destroyed my home, took away my career, or told me to live according to their customs, at some point I would retaliate too. And this gets to the heart of something that drives me nuts about politics. And that fact is that almost no one seems to have even a basic 101 level understanding of psychology and human nature. Ron Paul was right because he took time to understand the root cause of problems, what motivates people, and human nature. And while Ron Paul was unsuccessful in his 2 campaigns for president, largely because the GOP rigged it and changed the rules to block him in 2012, he changed the country nevertheless. An entire youth group grew up around his ideas, which is today known as Young Americans for Liberty. And this group works to educate and organize college kids who then get like-minded representatives elected at the state house level. And they're still amped. Ron Paul was at their convention this year. People were crying and cheering. He has an entire group of people, an entire generation waking up to what he said. And public sentiment towards the wars began to change from this point on, making it not only popular for Obama and Trump to eventually run on ending the wars, but imperative. Public polls show that Americans these days want no more of nation building and regime change and war in general. We're done. We're exhausted by it. But I really question if we would have woken up to these things if that would have happened without Ron Paul. But it's about time. Americans are looking around them and they're realizing that over the past 20 years, our country has gone to, you know what. Our infrastructure is crumbling. Our bridges and airports and roads and trains, they're in desperate need of repair and updates and new safety measures. Our society is not doing great. You have wage stagnation. You have an increasing cost of living. We don't have enough housing. You have income inequality, unemployment, failing schools, increasing crime. In virtually no area are we doing well. We are a superpower in decline. And that is in large part because we have spent our money being everybody else's police dog, fighting in wars that don't pertain to us, and enriching our military-industrial complex on the taxpayer's dime. We have buried ourselves in debt that we see no way out of, and that's leading to inflation and problems with our currency. It's making all of us poorer in more ways than one. And ironically enough, we haven't even managed to stomp out deadly ideologies like communism or Islamic extremism in exchange. Not one bit. And that's because you don't stomp out deadly ideologies by becoming deadly yourself. Instead, we've sold out our own values and undermined the things we say we believe in, which has led many people within our own country to turn against things like limited government and free markets and individual liberty, because they think that's what we have right now. It's not even close, but we keep saying that's who and what we are, just like Trump and Reagan. And when you keep using the buzzwords, but carrying out policies that are actually the exact opposite, people start to believe you and think that those policies match the buzzwords. The biggest threat to capitalism is not communism. It's people who claim to support capitalism and freedom while carrying out policies that are anything but. Despite pulling out of Afghanistan and promises from Brandon, that we will soon leave Iraq, the military-industrial complex is still gearing up. Congress is actually on the verge of passing an increase to the Pentagon budget, preparing to allocate $740 billion for the fiscal year 2021 to 2022. That's more than Biden even requested. In fact, it's $37 billion more. Not only is this flatly absurd and counterintuitive, it also ignores the fact that the budget needed to be cut even before we left Afghanistan due to overwhelming corruption. In case you missed the headlines, there have been numerous instances of that corruption that have come to light in recent years. In 2016, the Pentagon tried to bury an internal study that found $125 billion in waste, out of fear that it would lead to budget cuts. In 2019, they managed to spend $61 billion in a single month. How, you might ask? Well, on $9,000 chairs and $4.6 million worth of crabs and lobsters, of course. Yeah. This was due to the use it or lose it approach to budget management, which incentivizes the Pentagon to use up funds lest they experience budget cuts the next go around. And this doesn't even begin to touch on the real depths of abuse. The Pentagon wastes an untold amount on weapons that are unworkable, unaffordable, or unnecessary. They overpay their buddies at Boeing and other contractors for these weapons, and then they abandon them to be blown up or, worse yet, seized by our enemies when it's time to leave. And for the record, the Pentagon has never once passed an audit, and therefore it never answers for the jaw-dropping amounts of waste, fraud, and abuse. They just keep getting more and more money. It is time to cut these jerks off. The hijackers on 9/11 meant to attack our foundations. They flew planes into our financial center as a symbol of their intention to attack our wealth and our way of life. Our government then gave them an assist by burying us in debt and endless wars, as sure as if they had been flying the planes themselves. America can be the beacon on a shining hill yet again, but to do so, we have got to return to our foundations. We need to return to free trade, to free movement, and to free markets, and to staying out of conflicts unless they present a real, pressing, direct threat to our country. We need to focus on rebuilding domestically. We need to focus on reclaiming our constitutional rights. And we need to use our tax dollars on ourselves. If we did that, we would save trillions of dollars, millions of lives, and the world would likely become a much more peaceful place. Okay, that is it for this month's Base. Thank you so much again for tuning in. Thank you especially to all the people who've been with me from day one for the past year. I literally could not have done this without you. Every like, comment, share is just another step that we need to help get this show in front of more people. So thank you again. Be sure to subscribe, like the episode, comment on the episode. Until then, I'll see you next month. In honor of you, I'd like hot